Hello, everybody. This is Jacek Bartosiak, Strategy and Future, and my guest is Nicholas Myers. How are you, Nick?
I'm doing fine, Jacek. How are you today?
I'm fine too, and both of us are dressed up so neatly and nicely and beautifully because we're going to talk about the most important matter, in my personal opinion. I'm not sure how Nick thinks about it, meaning Western Pacific and strategies in the Western Pacific. So let's get started, Nick.
Sure. So, some people who have been listening to us talk for some time have already heard us speak a bit about these island chains. This was, of course, the Japanese concept invented in the early 20th century to figure out how best to control Asia as they were thinking about securing a number of supply chains at the high point of their imperial era. But it has actually proven to be quite useful for thinking about things while China's capabilities have been relatively limited. I'll share the map now so we get look at this again so people aren't just assuming that they know what we're all talking about the same thing. So colloquially, the most important ones that we've already spoken about are the first island chain, which runs from Sakhalin through Japan and Taiwan, the Philippines, and Borneo and Sumatra. And then the second island chain, which sometimes it changes definitions, but usually it's the Kuril Islands or the Aleutian Islands down to Guam and the Mariana Islands, sometimes including the Bonin Islands here off of Japan, down to Papua New Guinea in Australia. Very, very seldomly you'll hear about the third island chain, which usually does include the Aleutian Islands, out to some of these smaller ones like the Kiribati, and even out to Fiji. But we're going, I think, to talk today about looking at it from the opposite perspective. Because the thing is that the island chain notion, as we originally understood it, though, in my opinion, extremely useful for thinking about how to deal with China from a position of strength, may not be how we should be thinking about China these days as its economy becomes more and more entrenched. And it's starting to have perhaps not political successes so far, but a number of influence and economic successes around the world. So if we're trying to think about how the competition between the US and China is going to function across the Pacific at large, then we're going to need to look at potentially broader concepts. So start zooming way far out here, just to emphasize that we've been in the West, and especially in the United States, we've been talking about the Indo-Pacific pretty much constantly since about 2018, when the Trump administration decided to drop the old Asia-Pacific term in favor of it. And the concept here was quite simple. If you brought in India as part of a competition with China, now you had both India and Japan, which are both very substantial economies and force postures to potentially surround China. And obviously the Quad also incorporates Australia, though, as I've said before, Australia, though geostrategically extremely important and very pro-United States, its resources are much more comparable to Canada's. We tend to exaggerate it in our heads. They don't have especially large population or economy, but they are in a very important position for US power projection. But if we think about it from the way that the Chinese still prefer to consider it, they still will rail against the United States choosing the Indo-Pacific concept because they much preferred the Asia-Pacific one before. And how that is framed is that you think of the entire Pacific Rim as one large international unit. And so you get, especially these APEC summits, which were all the rage in the Obama years and even some time beforehand. You have a combination of Latin American leaders with the Russian leadership, as well as the ASEAN countries and the other places, as well as the United States, Canada, and Australia. And this, I think, is still what the Chinese would prefer to think about when they're talking about competition with the United States. So it really is a pressure on both sides trying to get the opposite impression out there. So instead of just talking about the first, second, possibly even third island chain, we can think about the fourth island chain of Hawaii down to these almost unpopulated places out here in French Polynesia and I suppose the Pitcairn Islands next. We can even think about a fifth island chain of the areas directly around the coastline of the right around the coastline of the Americas and the East Pacific, which is something that the Americans are not used to thinking about in a strategic sense. And how I introduce this is showing this map here. This map is the 2020 economic figures of total trade turnover for the United States and China around the world. And all this does is it measures if it's a more red country, does China have more trade with that country than the United States does? And if it's more blue, does the United States have more trade with that country?
For what year is that, Nick?
For 2020. It's not a dramatic difference because of coronavirus. It's decreased slightly. The Chinese have increased their range in a couple of places, but mostly the same as in 2019. Yeah, very new information. And I think the first thing that's going to strike anybody looking at this map is just how few countries are tinged blue. How few countries are still trading more with the United States than with China. Now, to a certain extent, this reflects the elementary dynamics of the US and the Chinese economies. The United States is not a trade-based economy except in very specific sectors. Trade, according to the full figures they've published to the United Nations, is only 18% of US GDP, which is incredibly small for a rich country. For China, by contrast, it's 32%, so just about almost double that. For places like Poland and other countries in the European Union, Poland is 86%. This simply has much to do with the fact that supply chains are spread all across the European area, but the United States is uniquely insulated from the global trade dynamic, except, of course, in very specific things that they are dependent on for semiconductors from Taiwan and previously oil from the Middle East. Though, as you'll see here, the yellow and red tinting on the Middle East shows just how much China is dependent upon it now than the United States is, what with shale oil and improved pipeline access to Canada. The other thing, though, that needs to be emphasized in this map is that, though I don't think it's terribly surprising to hear that Australia does trade considerably more with China, considering just the proximities, the tyranny of distance implied in economics, I think it will come as a shock that a number of the countries in the southern cone of South America are now disproportionately trading with China. And it's not like it's an extreme quantity. These lighter tinges are, of course, only in the nearer range of the trade spectrum, whereas in Africa and Asia, it's much, much more extreme. However, the Western Hemisphere, at least according to Russian strategists that we talk about frequently on this channel, is an American sphere of influence, which is no longer necessarily the case from a purely trade perspective. And what's more important, the southern cone of South America is far more economically vibrant than the portions of the northern section of the continent, simply due to improved weather. As you get farther away from the equator, it just makes it easier to sustain large-scale agriculture, which is part of why the G7 International Aid and Development crowd has been so focused on South-South trade and their frustrations at the inability to get it going, simply because there's less South for the trade to emerge from, and especially from the productive sections of the world. So, especially as the United States has gotten embroiled with the trade war with China during the Trump years, the Chinese have simply moved in and started buying everything up from Brazil because they have more comparable agricultural capacity than do other countries such as in Africa or even Australia, which is, of course, mostly a desert. Australia is not necessarily Africa. But as we think about this then, when we're thinking about the Western the U.S. sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, it's really limited to the Caribbean basin. With the exception, obviously, of Cuba. But Cuba has had a long time to adjust away. Venezuela is basically balanced despite the United States and Venezuela having a huge political spat over the past couple of years. But even Nicaragua, which is currently in quite a political difference with the United States, is also disproportionately dependent on the United States for its trade, which does limit how threatening these regions can possibly be, especially since it's all downrange. But as we go into the Southern Cone, this region here in Neuquén in Western Argentina is actually the site of China's largest overseas space control facility. I don't know much of the details of what precisely is operated there, but obviously you need to distribute, if you're going to have a worldwide space positioning system, as the United States, China, and Europe do, then you need to have several stations around the world in order to calibrate all of the signals going back and forth. And this region here hosts China's largest one. I remember correctly, I believe there's more Chinese personnel working there than at the one official logistics military base overseas in Djibouti. There's other smaller facilities that China maintains, if I'm remembering correctly, in Namibia, Kenya, and Pakistan. But
in Namibia, you would confirm, Nick, that they have the naval facility in Namibia?
Not a naval facility, a space facility.
A space facility.
Though in Namibia, it's a particularly interesting case, is the Russians and the Chinese appear to be competing for access to Walvis Bay. It's interesting mostly because the Chinese and the Russians are actually pretty good at deconflicting their interests in much of the outer sections of Eurasia. But the Russians have mostly given Latin America over to Chinese influence. So as we're thinking about what are the possibilities of Chinese force projection in this region, it still is extremely limited. But there is a means of trading on this now, which the United States, I don't think, has woken up to yet in terms of just how destabilizing this could be, especially since the Chinese will from time to time send their hospital ship to do diplomatic missions in the Caribbean specifically, i.e. directly under America's nose. And I think this is honestly its own psychological operation to keep the Americans off balance, fearing about to what extent the Chinese are buying up these individual islands in the East Caribbean. Some of them there actually is significant influence, but honestly, the trade here is the most lopsided in favor of the United States, something like 10, 25 times that with China, simply due to the fact that there's great proximity. These are tourism-based places, and it's with people from America and Europe that are sustaining these places, and not Chinese goods, in a way that Chinese demand really is starting to remake the politics of Argentina, Brazil, and even Chile. So as we start to think about how China is going to potentially project influence against the United States as sort of a reverse island chain notion, I think that we really should be thinking about it in terms of this being the southern cone of Latin America being the most heavily infiltrated forward island chain, if we want to misuse the term. But it's the same manner as the United States has been using quite effectively the first island chain in Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, even Indonesia over the 20th century, and continues to do so to a large extent, but perhaps a somewhat lesser extent in the 21st. What's important to note on all of this, and I think I mentioned this before, is that when you list off the islands of the first island chain, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Borneo, I think even the most geographically challenged people will be able to know where those are. Whereas if we go into the second island chain of Bonin Islands and Guam and so forth, they'll know like, oh yeah, it's in the Pacific, but it's a lot more nebulous because these islands are not famous. They're quite small and their economic potential is quite limited. Their military potential is real, as the Second World War demonstrated. But if you wanted to obliterate Guam with a couple of nuclear weapons, you don't need more than like 5, which the Chinese definitely have and can reach without very long-range weapon systems. when you get out of the third island chain, like nobody's heard of half of them except for Hawaii. And you get out to the fourth island chain, like the Galapagos perhaps aren't exactly a part of a coherent chain. But once you start talking about Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, now we're talking real places. Obviously, with Latin America, the populations are much smaller than they are with Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, but it's still a real leverage point and one that the United States isn't preparing for, since there is no strategic, I would say, dimension to what's primarily a Fourth Fleet operation AO, Fourth Fleet area of responsibility. Fourth Fleet is the area responsible for the naval components of Southcom. They mostly do drug trafficking interceptions. And I think that we're going to increasingly need to consider, how do we deal with Chinese political interference in the region in order to ensure that there is not a serious possibility of them building up rival capabilities to what the United States has. Because fundamentally, the logic of the island chains as Japan envisioned them 100 years ago is starting to fall apart as the Chinese gain access to longer and longer range weapon systems. So for those of you who have read the novel Ghost Fleet, which I have some questions.
I did.
It's a fun book.
And also, by the way, Nick, I read a week ago this newest novel by Stavridis, 2035, about a major, defeat of the American Navy in the 30s, the 21st century. 33 ships sunk in one battle.
But the thing that unites those books is that we are underestimating the Chinese ability to project a whole bunch of force out to a considerable length into the Pacific Ocean. Now, I think the book somewhat overstates the degree to which they could control absolutely everything, and obviously there's some degree of fiction that's involved in this that makes the book more exciting. But we're still thinking automatically when we talk about, in the United States, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy, how we're going to use allies and partners in order to make sure that if there is a conflict with China, it appears that it's going to be so overwhelmingly lost to China that the conflict is deterred. And for that perspective, you do want Japan and India, whereas in Ghost Fleet, famously, Japan doesn't do anything because Chinese can outrange everything, and they basically threaten that Japan won't be a country anymore if they decide to properly resist. And I think that as we start moving back towards that scale of logic, where instead of thinking about containment through a series of cruise missile and ballistic missile ranges, we're talking more about the option of assured destruction, or even the option of total economic paralysis, if we don't want to go back fully to the assured destruction model that was being developed in the 1960s, then we are going to be seriously imagining quite a different world in which at shorter and shorter ranges, the United States is going to be paralyzed from acting even in its own region. And I think that that's something that we need to start to get our minds around when we think about the Western Pacific at large. Because when we're thinking now about the Western Pacific, we're thinking primarily about how do we keep a ship presence out there with the option of shutting down Chinese access, especially to the Middle East. Well, if we're now also dealing with the parallel Chinese option to shut down some very elementary US infrastructure inside the Western Hemisphere, either through non-kinetic means, such as cyber attacks like we saw with the Colonial Pipeline not long ago, which the Chinese were not behind, but might as well could have been, or by kinetic means, by just having missile capacity to shut down the Panama Canal without even needing to get any suspicious personnel in there, which they'd probably be able to do anyhow because of their global maritime presence, then we are looking at a serious range of options against which the United States cannot confidently plan in the way that the strategic culture currently exists. And from that point onward, no matter how much China is alienating its various neighbors with very aggressive posturing by politics and rhetoric these days, it may not matter one little bit to its ability to compete in an escalation of contingencies, let's say, even before a conflict has started, or what we've been calling the escalation ladder, strategy and future. It may now sufficiently confounded that the United States is in fact dealing with a proper peer competitor, even if the United States still has superior military experience around the world. Mm-hmm. I'll give a pause there because I've been talking for quite some time. You take whatever questions you have, but we'll go into further.
Thinking about my questions and our listeners and viewers, I'd like you to recapitulate what it all means in terms of strategy in the Pacific, especially in the Western Pacific. Please explain it to the people that already know about the chains of islands, about the air sea battle, about the U.S. presence in the Western Pacific, about all those economic ideas that were being floated both by China and U.S. How does that translate into the real posturing, into the real rivalry? Okay.
It's honestly kind of difficult to translate it directly, which is part of why this is a severe imbalance that I think needs to be addressed. And now, to try to take it at that literal level, what does this mean for air-sea battle? Well, I mean, the simple answer is that if Japan can be deterred from being sympathetic even to the United States during a conflict, this incredibly reduces the amount of logistical resupply options that the United States is going to be able to run doing air-sea battle in the Western Pacific. Because without Japan, presumably under those circumstances, you probably don't have the Philippines either, because their degree for deterrence is somewhat less. So your other logistical options in the West Pacific are Singapore, which is quite favorable to the United States, probably would also be deterred if Japan's also gone, but there is U.S. logistics forward position there. Australia, which does have a pretty good relationship with the United States and would be able to do some degree of interoperability of resupply. Plus, there's a couple of small infrastructure agreements already in place for doing naval logistics between the U.S. Navy and the Royal Australian Navy. But of course, Australia is very far away from the actual battlefield. The South China Sea is not especially small. The distance here is something, I think, 1,000 kilometers across, if I remember correctly. I apologize if I'm getting that wrong, but you can see visibly here, the distance between Brunei and China being 1,000 kilometers notionally is still the distance between the part of Australia where no one lives in Brunei. And then all of the logistics and so forth are in Eastern Australia with some further capabilities in Perth, which is still quite far away. So if we're talking about doing a sortie generation, if we're not going to compromise sortie generation by keeping the forward logistics, that's going to put all of the pressure on the U.S. ally in Palau, which will stand by the United States, is indeed quite close, but of course downrange from Chinese missiles. And then Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, this island chain here, which is, of course, also under the range of Chinese missiles. So if you want to be beyond the confident range of Chinese missiles, short of the rather long-range interregional or intercontinental ballistic missiles, we're talking going out to Hawaii. And when you're now operating all of these things from Hawaii, I would say that it's pretty easy to say that the air-sea battle sortie generation rate is probably going to be 1/3 at best compared to what if it's being run out of Yokosuka.
Yeah. By the way, Nick, just again for our listeners to know, because people watch films, movies, okay, and that everything is visible from space, and how is that in reality these days? Whether the Navy ships are seen or not seen, and under what circumstances, what is the situation awareness, for countries like China and US in the vastness of the Pacific?
So I don't want to talk too far out of terms, obviously. I'm not working with any classified information here. But the first thing to remember here is the ocean is big. I don't think that's a controversial idea. But they know the concept that we know where absolutely every ship is just false. I mean, we probably are getting data on where all the ships are with the vast network of satellites that currently are up in space. And if you have the appropriate amount of infrastructure looking at everything, you will, in fact, be able to track literally everything going on in the ocean. But that is an astronomical quantity of data. And it's something that until artificial intelligence is fully implemented as part of the intelligence process, and we are not quite there yet, it's just not going to be possible. Now, what this does mean, in my opinion, is that this does benefit the United States to a certain extent, as that does imply that there will be more ability to keep ships in the presence, in the Asia, Western Pacific presence, able to potentially deal very powerful counter blows to China. But it also means that you need to be small in order to survive. Large ships, for a combination of reasons, are just easier to detect. They're easier for you to find with a combination of satellites and other even non-visual recognition platforms. But in addition to that, most missile systems that exist these days, which are pretty much the exclusive domain with which naval warfare is still fought on the standoff basis, are going to automatically target larger things because that's what they're programmed to do. And targeting larger things, that means aircraft carriers followed by cruisers. I don't think there's any battleships left in the Pacific these days. As a result, just need smaller and smaller ships. Now, as we start moving more towards unmanned ships, I think this might start to balance the process, balance the current distribution of power again. And the United States Navy has been finally focusing on what they call distributed firepower across a region where it's
distributed lethality also.
Distributed lethality. I believe that's the actual term. You are correct. And this specifically abandons having large ships that are easy targets in order to have many ships that can hit with more than just the pop gun that the littoral combat ship is equipped with. This is going to take some time for the Navy to culturally get used to, but the work is being done now. Now, as artificial intelligence starts to creep into intelligence processing, I do think the intelligence capability of knowing where everything is in the Pacific is going to continue to grow. But it's also going to mean that in the short term, at the least, space is going to be the real vulnerability of intelligence and not the ability to just detect things going on in the ocean. For instance, through P8s flying around and sending out all sorts of signals to figure out where things are. The P8 is still going to be incredibly necessary for doing submarine tracking, even though space-based submarine tracking is increasingly a thing, though all the details of it are extremely classified. So I can't say anything about the technicalities of how that would function, but I do know that it's something that's now possible.
But with the use of artificial intelligence and algorithms of flows of the oceans and the waters of the sea and so on. Yeah.
But space is also one of those things that's impossible to predict how willing are both China and the United States, and of course, other smaller actors like India, Japan, and Russia, willing to use ASAT weapons to potentially disrupt that intelligence collection capability. My understanding, which is entirely based on speculation, because everybody's opinion is based on, everybody's view on this is based on speculation, having not done any tests to try to obliterate intelligence capabilities in Earth orbit since these capabilities first emerged in the late 20th century, is that even those smaller actors will be able to completely disrupt all satellite views of what's going on the Earth. Now, that's a particularly pessimistic opinion. I'm on the much more pessimistic extreme when it comes to satellite survivability. But that also means that I'm suspicious that any side is going to be willing to use ASAT weapons until they are quite conscious of the fact that they are losing a conflict. And if they are already at that point, then it depends on where the logic is of the fighting going on. Is it still primarily a sea-based war, or is things now escalated to land-based warfare during the execution of these operational concepts during these hypothetical conflict?
I dare to disagree slightly, Nick, with you, as I think that especially the Chinese side will be very much inclined and incentivized to kill by soft kill assets and hard kill assets, American satellites, American space-based infrastructure that allows situational awareness on Earth, because the US is too much reliant upon it. So that's a major weakness. And also they may do it not because of the offensive posture of the Chinese thinking, but also from the defensive stance. If you feel that someone has such an advantage, superiority against you in this new domain that can create the beheading attack, of the center of command and even political leaders, with both strategic and operational and even tactical surprise from far away using the space-based assets, then you want to preventively knock them out. So space assets are, as opposed to the Cold War, where they were stabilizing the situation because of the nuclear exchange stability, now they destabilize the situation to the favor, creating a cascade of reasoning that may lead up to preventive action in space that may trigger war. That's my perspective. I'm just finishing the book about space, so.
And I think that that's a perfectly plausible perspective. And I do agree with you completely that it's more to China's advantage to try to neutralize American assets in space, if only because it's easier for China to replace that intelligence with air-based intelligence if the fighting is going to be happening in the Western Pacific.
Yeah. By the way, Nick, I forgot to ask you before, and I'll permit myself to do it in public. I need to convince you to play on Zoom, right as we speak today, to the public, the sort of a simulated war game over Taiwan, you being China or me being US or the other way around. And let's try to simulate within 1 hour what our actions would be, for example, if I implement the quarantine against Taiwan. What do you think about this idea?
Oh, I'm happy to do that, but you want me to be the United States?
Okay, you'll be the States, I'll be China, Chonghua. So that's fine, but we'll see how it works.
He says this, I'm much more comfortable doing red team usually. I find it much more interesting, but yeah,
that's what I thought, Nick. This is what I thought. You always were doing the red team. That's why I proposed China to you, but I understand you're preferring US.
We'll see what we can come up with. I'm sure we'll be able to do something.
Yeah. So coming back to the main subject, and what do you think about the Philippines? Are they really on the American side, or they would like to be neutral already as we speak? And if they stay neutral, is it possible to project power to South China Sea by the US Navy?
Good questions all. My view on the Philippines is that the general political disposition is to not care about US-China competition. There is plenty of nationalism in terms of anger at China taking control of individual islands that the Philippines claims. But this is generically true across most of Asia. Most of these political cultures are extremely nationalist these days. And so to that extent, it's a salve for potential alignment with the United States. However, Philippine elite alignment is extremely pro-US. The entire bureaucratic structure there is quite unhappy with how the people elect anti-U.S. people when the military and political elite in the Philippines are aware of the fact that any stance that they have for maintaining sovereignty against various Chinese declarations that this island belongs to us or various maritime actions are entirely dependent on outsiders. Because one curiosity about ASEAN at large over the past 30 years is that as the region has become much, much wealthier quite recently, mostly due to the fact that a number of Western manufacturers are doing the China Plus One strategies for the past number of years, which has been a huge boom for these places. Almost all of the ASEAN members have paralleled invested in military capabilities. So if we go back to like 1990, many of these countries were almost incapable entirely of defending themselves. The Vietnamese obviously had a tradition of defense, so had a pretty strong military culture in addition to enough mass to defend themselves. The Burmese, to a certain extent, also. Singapore had sophisticated equipment, but the Philippines, Malaysia, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, it's not that they were undefended, but they were very far behind, especially since places like Thailand and Laos and Cambodia were much more interested in suppressing insurgencies internally. Now, 30 years on with everybody richer, virtually everybody has much better capabilities than they had 30 years ago. Like Malaysia, if I remember correctly, has Leopard tanks, which is nothing to sneeze at.
And
the last
also
country left behind that has not modernized.
They have the Polish modernized
Yes.
PT-91 tanks.
So nowadays, when you're thinking about how you're going to make money by selling weapons abroad, whether you're a Russian or a Pole or German or British or United States or Chinese, you look to ASEAN because everybody needs to replace the fact that they didn't have any serious capabilities before.
True.
Now, the Philippines is starting to correct that. They've drastically increased their cooperation with Japan, which is a bit of a historical difficulty. I mean, most countries in Southeast Asia have prickly relations with Japan, with some weird exception. Like Indonesia is extreme. Indonesia and Palau, for instance, are very pro-Japan, because in Indonesia, the Japanese occupation is remembered as getting rid of the Dutch. So there, it's a bit reversed. But for a number of these places, it's reversed. It's reversing at this moment. And South Korea is increasingly an active arms dealer in ASEAN as well. But still, my point here is that the Philippines sticks out as the one truly more counterinsurgency and incapable of sovereign defense country left in ASEAN, which really makes balancing against against China relatively difficult if you're only going to rely on your own sovereign capabilities.
Sure.
So my suspicion at large is that if the threat China is making that finally instigates a conflict is against another ASEAN member or against Japan, South Korea, a demonstration of the fact that China is not going to be bossed around by other countries around it, then I'd be guessing the Philippines is going to be part of the bandwagoning effect back with the United States to demonstrate that this is not allowed, even if it doesn't turn into a kinetic war. It certainly turns into quite a political freeze in the Asia region. By contrast, if China was to be going after Taiwan, and the United States was the one perceived to be doing most of the escalation, since everybody's aware of the fact that China has always claimed that Taiwan is part of China, then I think the Philippines will be much more inclined to take a neutral stance, whereas places like Japan and Australia will be more inclined to side with the United States, if not necessarily ultimately deciding to do so.
Yeah, Nick, I think that's the moment to stop our conversation and heavily rely on your promise to really, make a war session with me over Taiwan.
It sounds like fun.
Yeah, it sounds like fun. And I think that this sort of simulated war we're going to have will include all those elements we've discussed today, because all they will factor in the, how it's going to play out,
The last point I'll throw out there, just to tie a bow on the Philippines discussion, I do think Rodrigo Duterte, the current president of the Philippines, is very much the biggest Viktor Yanukovych acolyte there is out there. I'll take whatever free stuff the outside world gives to me in exchange for being nice for a while, but that's the limit of his faithfulness.
Yeah, but you know, using this narrative, his foreign minister is known for having a nerve and a hot tongue, as we say in Polish. So he really uses sometimes very, very dirty words to describe his, for example, the Philippines' relationship with China and so on. Like 2 weeks ago, it was a very much commented Twitter tweet by this guy. You know, worth watching. The guy is worth watching because of his picturesque character in a way.
Teodoro Locsin, if you want to look him up.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Nick. Our guest today was Nicholas Myers. We have discussed slightly the Pacific. The subject is as vast as the Pacific Ocean itself. Of course, we'll get back to it. And now we will end. And after I press the button end, I'll talk to our guest how to approach the war game that we have promised to you guys. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you very much, Jacek.
And it was Jacek Bartosiak, Strategy and Future. Thanks a lot.